when we create standards, sometimes those standards end up getting used by someone that's maybe a brand new facility, never worked in the industry before, doesn't know anything about the industry, and they've got to be able to pick up this document from day one, understand it, and be able to read it. Now, if that document was written by someone who's worked in the industry for 20 years, that document might be written in a way that that person can understand, but not in a way that someone new to the industry can understand.
Welcome to the AttractionPros podcast, where we discuss the latest trends and challenges facing the attractions industry today.
We chat with some of the top leaders in the field and provide resources that will help develop your career in this great industry.
I am Josh Liebman, founder of BackLooper. I help attractions collect guest feedback and identify top priorities needed for improvement.
And I'm Matt Heller, founder of Performance Optimist Consulting. I help leaders lead so they can increase employee engagement and retention.
Now sit upright, hold on tight, and get ready for the AttractionPros podcast. Hey, Matt, how are you?
I am fantastic. How are you, Josh?
I'm doing well. I was on the edge of my seat during that very slight pause you gave there. Those listening to this on 1.5 or 2x probably didn't even pick up on the pause.
Oh, that's funny.
That's how I listen to podcasts. Do you listen at normal speed?
That's interesting. No, I listen at normal speed. Yeah, I've never listened
really
at faster speeds.
I almost always listen to podcasts at 1.5 times the speed.
And why is that?
I think it's because I'm obsessed with efficiency. And if I've got a 1-hour podcast, I can get through it in 40 minutes.
Yeah, that's a good point. I might have to try that. I don't know. I figure that's the way it was recorded. That's the way I should listen to it. I don't know. That's just the way I've always been. But if someone right now is listening to, us at 1 or 1.5 times, then this will probably sound normal.
And what's really funny is those that normally listen to 1.5 times the speed like I do, when I slow it down to 1, the way that you just talked is how I always hear it.
Gotcha.
I feel like, why would they talk so slowly? I'm so used to hearing them talk at 1.5 times the speed as their normal voice.
Yeah. Well, I think part of it too is my brain. I don't know if I could catch all the good stuff going by that fast.
At 1.5, I feel like you end up getting used to it. Once you get into 2x, you can't do anything else. Like you just got to be sitting and listening for everything. But
Gotcha.
So I've found that 1.5 is like my optimal. I can go a little faster, but I can still catch everything that's being talked about. But anyway, that has nothing to do with our guest today, other than our guest Linda Freeman is on our podcast.
Absolutely. And this is one that you'll want to, if you normally listen at twice the speed, you might want to slow it down because she's got a lot of good stuff to say.
Absolutely. So Linda Freeman is the industry manager specializing in the amusement industry at Rockwell Automation, which is really cool. For those who might be in the ride operations area of our industry, guarantee you have used Rockwell's products, specifically Allen Bradley control panels. They seem to be just about everywhere. I believe most, if not almost all of the rides I've ever operated were Allen Bradley. So we get to talk all about ride control systems, but also safety is going to be, I would say, the overarching topic of this interview and this conversation today, and really about how safety has evolved and is continuing to evolve throughout time, and the way that many of the safety-related organizations and associations stay on top of it and are able to collaborate together to be able to define the best standards for the amusement industry.
Yeah, and I'm really interested to hear Linda talk about not only what those standards are, but how we all can contribute, because I think that's one of the big things that we have to take into consideration about where these standards come from. It comes from us, right? It comes from the people that live and breathe and work with these machines every single day, volunteering their time to give people their experiences, share what has gone right and what has gone wrong, so that they can put that ultimately into a standard that's going to help somebody else.
Right. And when it comes to volunteering, the more people that contribute, the more people that volunteer their time and their resources and knowledge, that the better the standard is. The sum is greater, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, I think is what Stephen Covey said in 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. But we also talk about, the diversity of that thought. When you're having these meetings and defining these standards, it can't be, everyone bringing their same background to the table and into the room. We need people from multiple departments, multiple backgrounds, multiple ways of thinking, to be able to continuously challenge and update and improve safety standards.
And speaking about bringing in people with great ways of thinking, what do you say we get to this interview with Linda?
Let's get to this amazing conversation with Linda Freeman. Linda Freeman, industry manager specializing in the amusement industry at Rockwell Automation. Welcome to the AttractionPros podcast. So exciting to have you here today. How are you?
I am great, and I'm absolutely thrilled to be chatting with you guys today.
Awesome. We are very excited to dive into this conversation. So to get this started, can you just tell us a little bit about your role with Rockwell?
Yeah, so I work for Rockwell Automation. A lot of people know it better as Allen Bradley. We're the controls company. And I work with our clients around the world, helping them pick the best safety and security industrial automation solutions. And then I also represent the company on a lot of industry standards and industry trade shows.
Awesome. So tell us about, I guess, your background in the industry and, maybe just a little bit kind of the areas that you focus on within Rockwell.
Sure. So I've been with the company about, I don't know, like 3-4 years, and I had the opportunity to move to Florida. I'd always wanted to live in Orlando. And when I moved there, I get my client list for who I'm going to be working with, and I'm like, theme parks? I get to go to theme parks for a living? And I didn't know when I started working in Orlando all the technology that goes behind making a ride stop and start and do that safely, and how the show lights work and the things interact. And so my background's electrical engineering, control systems. And so I took what I had done in other industries. I'd worked in pulp and paper and manufacturing and food and beverage. And I applied that then to amusement parks. So when you look at ride systems and control systems on attractions, pretty much anything that moves in a controlled fashion in a ride, there's some kind of technology behind it that makes that move and ensures that it moves safely and only moves when it's supposed to move. So I started working in the theme park business in 2000, and I'm here I am 20 years later, still there. And it's just a great field. It's so much fun.
That's cool. Linda, can you take us back to when you first maybe even visited your first client in the theme park world and said, what the heck is going on here? Can you just kind of walk us through that?
Oh, yeah. No, I distinctly remember that. Being able to go backstage and see how an attraction is built. There was this one particular ride that they had taken one of our products that normally would kind of mount like this, straight up and down, and they had mounted it on its back. And it was on a vehicle going at a very fast pace. And it was subjected to vibration and shock and air contaminants and all kinds of things that you don't normally have to think about when something's mounted in a control cabinet in a controlled environment. And I was like a kid in the candy store. I just remember walking around going, oh, wow, look, there's a sensor there and a push button there and a controller there. And just wrapping my mind around everything that it takes in an attraction. And even as a guest now, when I go into parks, I'm constantly looking. I challenge everyone here on the podcast, next time you get on a ride, take a little peek over at the ride console. Look at all the buttons on the console, look at the operator interface, look down safely, stay behind your gate, but look down into the load unload platform, look at the spinning tires, look at the motors on the tires, look at all the little sensors. Like, there's just so much technology in these attractions. And every attraction I go to still today, I still see something I've never seen before, seen an application of technology in a way I've never seen before, and then technology is constantly changing. So there's all sorts of new types of sensing technologies, controllers, motors on drives, flat motors now, linear motors. The technology just continues to advance, just like attractions do.
So then, what are some of the differences, or what is it like to see an amusement ride in action, whether it's an amusement park or a theme park or a large attraction, compared to, say, maybe walking a factory floor or an automotive plant? Is it really just all the same thing going on in both of them, just a different purpose?
It is a different purpose, and there's one big difference. In automation, in manufacturing facilities, you don't have the guest component.
Right.
So there's a piece of machinery, and you're controlling that piece of machinery. And there may be, like in material handling and in automotive plants now, they're starting to use a lot of AGVs, automated guided vehicles, where maybe a worker actually gets up on the vehicle and is riding around with the car chassis as it's in the plant. But that person is trained. They know how that equipment works. They've been given OSHA safety training. They know how to interact with that piece of machinery. They're at a different education level because they've been taught, you know, how to not electrocute themselves, how to not get a pinch point. But when you go to theme parks, you have the same thing. You've got wildly crazy moving vehicles, but there's all these hazards there that the guest might not realize, because what do we do to guests? We send them to theme parks and we put them in a fantasy land and we tell them that they're safe. But there's still inherent hazards in every attraction. There's pinch points, there's falling things, there's, if the ride behaves in a way it's not supposed to, does the guest know how to react? So that's the biggest component that's different. All the rest of it's the same. The technology that you use, the principles that you apply, the way that you design systems, all of that's the same. We just, when we do our risk assessments in the amusement industry, we have to add that extra component of reasonably foreseeable what might happen when a guest is interacting with this piece of equipment.
Linda, I'd love to dive a little deeper on that, because obviously there's a lot of study of, you know, guest behavior and that kind of thing, but how can you anticipate what a guest is going to do? I mean, I've worked in theme parks for a long time, and one of the things we say is they leave their brain in the car. So how can we really anticipate what they're going to do to try to facilitate them, you know, keeping them safe?
Yeah, and I'm going to give a shout out to one of my colleagues. Dr. Catherine Woodcock from Ryerson University specializes in human factors. And she encourages us all to think, what is the environment that we're putting the guest in? And you're right, we always crack that joke of, oh, the guest leaves their brain in the car, but we actually told them to. We told them to leave their brain in the car, right? We told them to come to our facility and get away from the world and forget about your troubles and be in a fantasy land. And so we have to think about that when we're designing attractions. She did a great session at the IAAPA conference 2 weeks ago in Orlando, talking about human factors. There's kind of 3 ways of human factors. There's things that people just kind of do accidentally. There's things that they do in a reaction or like in a slip. And so to answer your question, how do we gather that? Well, first, what's happened in the past? So talking to people within your own facility, looking at your logs of what guest incidents have been, participating in organizations where you get to meet people from other companies, other theme parks, and hearing their stories, and then kind of keeping a record of that, keeping up with podcasts like yourself, like what are going trends in industry, like when selfie sticks came out. Nobody thought what a safety hazard selfie sticks were going to be. So there's always something that's changing. So it's having a group of people that sit, and that's what they do. That's what the whole risk assessment process is thinking about reasonably foreseeable things. We don't have to worry about a meteor strike, but we do have to worry about a kid possibly running off away from their parent because they got afraid of something. And so it's time consuming and it's tedious, but it needs to be done up front. And that's one of the things Dr. Woodcock talks about a lot, is that in that early design of an attraction, to walk yourself through with that blank brain of, I've never been here before, I'm with my family, I'm distracted, I'm having fun, which way could I possibly go wrong? Which way could I possibly stick my arm out? And just put yourself in the eyes of a guest.
I feel like it can be difficult for those foreseeable risks, for those conversations to at least get started, because you're actively trying to come up with potential scenarios that you never want to think of happening. So how do you, I guess, kind of get that ball rolling into saying, you mentioned a kid that might be running away from his parents. You could extend that to say, well, now they're entering the ride vehicle or a ride envelope of a moving vehicle and the risks that can happen there. So of course, it's like we all know what many of the possible outcomes are, but what you're saying is they need to be brought to the forefront and just open on the table. So can you talk a little bit about kind of how those conversations get moving, when it can be something that's very sensitive?
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And the risk assessment process talks about the first thing you want to do is set the stage. So the first thing is creating an environment where it's safe and secure to talk about those things. Because lots of people feel nervous to maybe bring it up in a meeting, or they're not sure it's the right environment. And so creating a separate meeting where everybody knows that the purpose of the meeting is this is what we're going to talk about. It's going to be closed door. There's going to be one person taking notes. No one's going to be, in trouble if they bring up a crazy idea, but this is our brainstorming. And so you first create the environment and the expectation that this is what we're going to sit and do. This is the purpose of this meeting. And then you also encourage the people to kind of shift into that mindset of worst case scenario. Turn into that parent that's scared of all the things that your kids are possibly going to do. And then you have a designated record keeper that as ideas are coming up, they're writing those down, and then you just kind of flesh out every idea. But I think it's a lot of times when we get in our design review meetings, somebody might be scared to bring something up, or they might think, oh, my idea is kind of crazy, I shouldn't mention it. So having that meeting early in the process where you tell everybody, no, this is what we're doing in this meeting. We're going to sit and talk about all the things that have happened before and what possibly could happen. And then when that meeting's done, we move on to design and the rest. And so it's setting that stage and then setting that mindset and giving people the comfort and kind of the permission to sit and have that conversation.
And I would imagine that having so many different entities and associations that are dedicated to safety is also helpful for that conversation, right? Because you can talk to other facilities, and you can get what you like to talk about, diversity of thought and diversity of input and things like that. So could you talk a little bit about how just all those different associations can really help with that conversation as well?
Yeah, diversity of thought. That's a great point. The risk assessment process says when you sit and you start talking about all those things that could possibly happen, you don't want to have all the same people in the room. So you don't want to have just ride operators. You want to have someone from your maintenance department. You want to have someone possibly from guest services that have heard complaints from the guest perspective, somebody from engineering, somebody from sanitation in the cleaning department. So every person that touches that attraction, you want to have someone representing in that group. But maybe you don't have all those people at your company. Maybe you're a small company and you've only maybe got ride ops or maybe one maintenance person, nobody from engineering. That's where these organizations come in. So there's two great organizations, AIMS International and NAARSO, and they're safety training organizations where you can attend classes and you can meet people from other parks or other facilities around the world, and they share best practices in these meetings. Like one of my favorite ones to attend is at AIMS. They have there's like a 2-hour maintenance, throw everything against the wall that's ever happened. It's a room of 100 people, and people are raising their hand saying, well, I had this problem, who fixed it this way? And then someone else will raise their hand and go, well, we had that problem, and this is what we did to fix it this way. Again, it's a safe environment. It's an environment where that's where everybody goes to meet other people, to talk about safety. And when it comes to safety, even though you might have 50 different competitors in the room, when it comes to safety, we're all on the same team. And we like to joke that it's co-opetition. We're going to cooperate with anything that's in regards to safety because it's better for the industry. We don't want to have any single facility anywhere in our industry, if it's an FEC, if it's a portable, if it's a theme park, a museum, an aquarium, we don't want to see anyone have an incident. And so I'd highly encourage those of you that are listening, if you've never participated in those organizations, join. It's a great way to meet people and to hear stories, to get that diversity of thought. And then when you have the meetings at your own facility, make sure you have people around the table that represent those different diversities of thought. How do the cleaning people interact with this? How do the operations people? How do the guest people? How does maintenance come in and interact? Because it's only through thinking about all those different perspectives that you're going to catch every little possible safety hazard.
So Linda, you've mentioned that there's a few different types of associations that are worth joining, and you've kind of broken them down into trade association, standards, and training. Can you just give just a quick overview of, I would say, what the differences are in any of those and what potential overlaps there might be among each one as well?
Yes, yeah. So the three categories I typically use are trade associations, and trade associations can have conferences and they can also do education. So examples of trade associations would be the International Associations of Amusement Parks and Attractions, so IAAPA. So IAAPA has our conferences we go to, they have our educational events, they also have what's called the Safety Institute. They do that a couple times a year, and that's usually for kind of more executive level, like directors and above that manage safety at organizations. Those are people that attend the Safety Institute. And then a sister to that would be, so you got trade associations, then the next would be training associations. And both of those types of organizations are usually nonprofits. So training associations, AIMS and NAARSO, and I can give you guys the links and you can put them in the show notes for people. So those two associations are geared toward maintenance and operations people, and they're strictly training events. They do have like a little small trade show that they also do at their training event, but the main purpose is the training event. And they bring together manufacturers and people that work in the industry, and they do sessions. I think, Matt, you spoke at AIMS last year, right?
Actually, I've been speaking at AIMS for many, many years, but last year I got to do the keynote, which was just, I was over the moon. It was awesome.
So what is your session on when you teach at AIMS?
I usually teach from the leadership standpoint. So I'll teach, about communication and, getting the most out of your team because, I don't have to tell you that, you're only as safe as your frontline operators, right? So, getting the leaders to be able to be effective leaders and communicate well, that's typically what I speak about at AIMS.
Yeah, so AIMS and NAARSO, they do a great job of taking the role of the frontline person, whether that frontline person is guest services, operations, maintenance, up to the management level of those types of groups within the organization. So I teach classes at those organizations around technology, around the automation technology. And then the third bucket is the standards development organizations. They're called SDOs. So those are the organizations that write standards that the amusement industry will build attractions to, and then they also will operate them to. So in the US, the most common one we use is ASTM F24. So ASTM International, they're a huge company. They're in multiple countries around the world, and they have all kinds of standards. Standards on like the table you're working at, or the maybe like the mattress you sleep on. They have all thousands and thousands of different standards. But one committee within all their thousands of committees is F24, and that's on amusement rides and devices. So it covers dry theme parks, wet theme parks, bungee courses, locomotives, zip lining. There's all kinds of standards that fall under the SDO. And so people that get involved there, they either want to learn more about the standard, they have an idea that they would like to see put into the standard. I'll give you an example. A few years ago, the vertical wind tunnel industry is really growing in the United States. Have you guys ever done like an iFly wind tunnel?
I have not.
Oh, so much fun. It's tons of fun. Well, they didn't have any standards. And so the companies that were making vertical wind tunnels, they wanted to get together and write a standard for, hey, this is how an amusement vertical wind tunnel should be built. So they came to ASTM and they wrote a standard. Same thing for like zip lines and locomotives. So the things that you get out of that is you get to contribute, you get to share your knowledge. I joined ASTM because I wanted to learn. I just sit quiet in the back of the room and would just listen. And I've learned so much through my participation in ASTM, and I got to meet people. I'd say with all three of those organizations, whether it's the standards, the training associations, or the trade associations, the one thing in common is you're going to meet people in industry. We're going to have something in common. You're going to have some safety story to share, or something that you've learned, or something that you did to increase your guest experience. It's a great place to learn. All three of those organizations are a great place to learn. And then depending on how you want to contribute as a person, if you want to contribute to helping to write better standards, that's where ASTM is great. If you want to contribute to educational content, then the trade associations or the training organizations are great places to go. Other trade associations would be TEA, like Themed Entertainment Association, or for the portable industry, there's OABA, the Outdoor Amusement Business Association. So there's a couple different trade associations. So great way to meet people and great way to learn. That's consistent across all three.
Sure.
And I think one of the great things you talked about there, Linda, is people's ability and quite frankly, responsibility to contribute, right? I think that's one of the big things that, people may not look at as a benefit. Oh, I'm going to join IAAPA. I'm going to go to Ames and I'm going to learn, but you get to contribute and be part of the industry and be part of what moves the industry forward. So can you talk a little bit about, from your perspective, how important it is that people get in and share those crazy ideas and ask that off the wall question because maybe somebody else is thinking about that. So from your experience, kind of how important is that piece?
Oh, definitely. I can think of examples when we've been sitting in the ASTM meeting and there'll be somebody in the back of the room that kind of, shyly raises their hand and go, I have a really weird question. And we always say there's never a weird question, because if you're thinking it, someone else is probably thinking it, or someone's going to think about it in the future. And when you think about the design of an attraction and everything that it takes to make that attraction safe, not one person can do it. Like, we all have our own way of how we approach things and how we think of things, and every person approaches and thinks differently. So having that diversity of thought where you get the different perspectives is so important. When you go read the standards that were written in Europe many years ago around the best practices of functional safety management, how do I create an organization that safety is part of the culture? Safety is owned by everyone. Everyone has to think about safety, and safety needs to be in every part of what you do, and then also have different perspectives to it. So it's just kind of I call it almost the fundamental breathing air of safety, having that diversity of thought, and then trying to get information that you can from different people and learning from different experiences is very, very important.
And then I imagine that over time, as new technologies are introduced, or whether it's just consumer trends or habits, that the standards tend to evolve to match the present day's situation. You mentioned selfie sticks a little bit ago, and I think that that's probably one example that I remember those first came out. They were super popular, and then there seemed to be just this unified voice of the industry that said, no, absolutely not. And it wasn't just theme parks, art museums and just a whole bunch of other places of saying this is, I guess, conflicting with safety policies. So we can use that as an example, or just in general, how the standards have evolved over time to, to match kind of what we're dealing with today.
Yeah, the selfie sticks is a good example. When those first came out, I remember we had a separate meeting at one of the ASTM meetings to just talk about that. Hey, what are you doing in your park? And what are you doing in your park? And what rule have you put in place? Because one thing we also have to think about with safety is we want to be consistent as an industry. When our guest goes to one experience in one location and then they go to this kind of similar experience in another location, we want them to perceive the safety to be the same. And that's kind of why I think you saw that everybody just went on selfie sticks, because they just all agreed. And these associations, that's another good thing they do, especially IAAPA. They're really good at bringing everyone together and getting them on the same page. Another thing you can do, talking about contributing, Matt, in IAAPA, there's committees you can join. So you can join the operations committee or the security committee or the safety committee. I sit on the security committee, and it's security leaders from parks all around the world. And we share stories of, these are incidents that happened in our facilities. These are the technologies that we're looking at. When COVID first came out, COVID's a great example of where the safety and the security committee, we merged together And then we worked with IAPA to help write that white paper around COVID guidelines, because the industry needed some kind of guidelines, and we wanted to have consistency across the industry.
So Linda, I totally agree about, getting involved with committees. I've been on the HR committee for many, many years, and just, so many connections that you can make when you're on a committee and working with people. It's just wonderful. What I'm curious a little bit about is, when you talk about the selfie sticks and you talk about the new standards and things like that, what are those conversations like when people say, I've got selfie sticks and I've got selfie sticks, and like, what do we do? Right. It's kind of those unofficial conversations that happen, and, kind of how those eventually turn into our standards. So could you kind of talk us a little bit about, kind of how that contribution works?
Yeah, and I'll walk through the COVID example, because that's probably the most real one that we all can kind of come to terms with. So the IAPA Safety and Security Committee, we have a scheduled call. The committee has a scheduled call, and we are all under, we have a confidentiality agreement that we sign, and we say that, hey, anything we talk about in this call stays within this call. And same thing, like when you go to the AIMS meetings and the NAARSO meetings, they make an announcement that, hey, we check to see if there's any reporters in the room. Are there any non-industry people in the room? IAPA does that at their sessions as well. We ask reporters to identify themselves, because again, we want to create a safe space so that people can share these stories, but then they're not worried about it showing up in the headlines the next day. So going back to the COVID example, so the Safety and the Security Committee got together, and we were having a call about every week, every other week, and just talking about things that were going on. And then we were working with IAPA of, okay, here's a checklist, and it just slowly builds over time. It's not like magically one day that white paper just showed up and it was done. It went through multiple iterations. But having all those different people, we had people from Mexico and people from Canada and from the US and from Europe. We had people from dry parks, water parks, museums, zoos. So we got a lot of different people to read it. And then they would tweak it, and they would say, well, this might work at this big theme park, but, I'm a little FEC, and maybe we should tweak the words to say this. That's how we make these documents better. That's how we make our training better. That's how we make our standards better, is we want to make sure that it's applicable to everyone. And so we would get on this call, and it's a round robin. And so the committee chair knows who all the people on the call are, and then he just goes one by one. Hey, do you have anything? What's going on in your region? What do you have? What do you have? We had a security professional that would come on board and would brief us of, hey, here's the latest thing the CDC has said, and here's what this country has said, and here's what the latest security announcement is on COVID. And it just built over time. But when I look at from the time we started until the time that document was published, we did it pretty quickly, because we had a team of dedicated people all sharing their ideas, committed to then read the draft, make comments, get it submitted, and then IAPA got it published. And that's what's really cool about this industry, is anything with security and with safety, there's people that volunteer and contribute, they share their ideas, they share their problems, they share their best practices, they pull together, and how's the expression go? Rising tides raises all boats, right? So everybody pitches in and helps. So that's kind of like a day in the life. That's what it was like on those calls, is we just got together for an hour or two every week or two and just hash through it.
And that really stresses the importance of that co-opetition too, versus competition, because I know we're all tired of the saying we're all in this together by this point, but at the beginning, and well, really, we still are, obviously, but it really stresses how true that is. I'm curious too, how all of these conversations and all of these decisions and standards that are being put in place, of course, they're there to stay a step ahead of potential outcomes or scenarios. But I'm also curious as far as interacting maybe with external or political or governance, really, and staying maybe a step or two ahead of that as well. We take COVID, for example, and every state has put in place their specific policies and restrictions and arbitrary color coding scheme. And if you follow me on Twitter or LinkedIn, I've been very vocal on occasion, and I've been very specific many times as well. Whereas then, you know, the white paper from IAPA was, I don't know, was it 50, 60 pages? I don't even remember, but I remember looking at the PDF and saying, all right, this was written by experts. This was written by people who actually know what to do to keep their employees and their guests safe, and are way smarter in this particular capacity than any politician or lawmaker. And I could stay on this soapbox for a while and keep going, but curious as far as I would say, honestly, protecting the integrity of sort of this industry's self-governance.
Yeah, so you had a couple questions wrapped up in there. So I'll address the first one is, how do you keep ahead of changing regulations? It's all volunteer. So what all these organizations that I'm talking about, whether it's IAPA, whether it's TEA, OABA, AIMS, NAARSO, ASTM, we are all volunteers. And it's because we're dedicated to safety and we want to help make our industry continue to be the wonderfully safe place that it is. So each of those organizations has their own initiative. Each one's a little different. So ASTM focuses at the country level. They are working with countries, and some of the most recent signings that went into place, and I'm going to forget the countries, they were in South America. I want to say maybe Colombia. So they worked ASTM corporate, and then some of the board of the ASTM F24, they went and met with government officials in that country, and they worked with that country to get them to sign in. We will acknowledge that ASTM F24 is the standard that we want recognized in our country. So that's kind of at the country level. In the United States, at the state level, you know, every state's very different. And so ASTM does also look at the state level, but in general in the United States, there's only maybe 1 or 2 states that's actually put ASTM into law. But ASTM is recognized as like a self-guiding standard, like if a park or facility comes forward and says, I do my safety per ASTM, you know, it's kind of a recognized standard. The organizations that spend more time at the state level, from what I see, AIMS and NAARSO, they work at the state level around what is said of the training that's required for inspectors, because every state has different inspectors that need to go in and inspect equipment. And there's usually requirements for the training that those inspectors must have. So AIMS recently, we worked with a state to get it written into the state language that the training for the inspectors, if they're inspecting amusement rides, has to be amusement specific safety training. It can't just be any safety training. So that's something those organizations work with. And then IAPA also has a public policy government advocacy group where they work at Washington. And so they're looking at where budgeting is going, where legislation is going, what are they doing around work visas and minimum wage, and they're advocating for the industry at our federal government level within Washington. So I'd say the industry tries to be very proactive as best as they can, though. We're volunteers. We're always looking for more volunteers to help keep up with all these state changes and laws and regulations. Changing technology, that's when people bring it to the organizations. The way AIMS and NAARSO works today, all of the instructors are volunteers. And if there's a company, like my company, we had some new technology come out. And so I was like, okay, let's go train on that. Let's make sure people know about that. Same thing with ASTM. As some of the technology has changed in ASTM, those of us that sit on the committee and know about that, we put it into the standard. When it comes to incidents though, we can't always predict. We don't, safety is never completely 100% safe. You know, there's always some inherent risk. And so anytime an accident happens in the industry, ASTM has a group of people on the board that sit and look at that accident and then ask themselves, hey, is there something in our standards that's missing? How could we have worked to maybe help prevent this? In the area of corrosion, for example, there were some new committees that were formed after the accident in Ohio around how to do proper corrosion inspection. And so that's language that's now getting balloted and put into the ASTM standard. The area of risk assessment, ASTM didn't really have very good language on risk assessment. So we have some volunteers that have come over from Europe some manufacturers from Switzerland and Germany and the Netherlands, and they've been helping to get more language in our ASTM standards here in North America that align more with what we see in Europe. ASTM standards are used around the world, but there's also 2 other standards, amusement standards, that are used over in Europe. There's a ISO standard and a EN standard, EN 13814 and ISO 17842. So those 3 standards organizations, those volunteers are committed to safety, so they work to try to harmonize. Now, when you think about it, those 3 organizations are technically competitors. They're all nonprofit companies trying to sell their standard and get their standard out into the industry, but they're committed to safety. And so those 3 organizations work together to make sure their standards are in alignment. So if you're a manufacturer and you build a ride and you deliver it to the US, or you deliver it to Europe, or you deliver it to China or to Russia or to Australia, we work in the industry as volunteers to try to make those standards as consistent around the globe as possible. But again, I can't harp enough. This all only happens through volunteers. And just like you guys, your way you contribute back to the industry is you created this podcast and you bring people like me to come on and talk and educate about things. And so I would just encourage everyone that's listening, however small you might think it is, every ounce of contribution matters.
Yeah, I think that's a great message. Even if it's a small, little something that you can do to contribute, I think it definitely matters, and it builds, right? It's a small foundation that kind of builds on different things. So I'm wondering, Linda, you talked about a whole bunch of different things in there that should be top of mind to people. Are there specific trends or kind of hot button topics that people are focused on right now? Maybe COVID related, maybe not, but things that people should be kind of should have on their radar?
Yeah, COVID really put us all for a loop, right? Our budgets got turned upside down. The revenues we were expecting didn't come in, but our expenses really didn't go away. Mm-hmm. And so we have a lot of tough decisions coming into this next season. You've probably got new sanitation requirements and sanitation costs. You might have had to buy new security equipment. I know a lot of facilities took the downtime as an opportunity to upgrade a lot of their security equipment. But when it comes to safety always has to be something we're constantly doing. I like to use the analogy of like running. If you're going to go be a runner, you have to always be a runner. If you want to always be able to do marathons, you have to always be running. The minute you stop running, your body, your muscles kind of lose that muscle memory, you kind of lose your cardiovascular, you kind of huff and puff the next time you go for a run. And safety is the same thing. And so I know COVID's been really tough for everyone and all of our budgets are slashed to pieces, but take a really strong look at what you're doing around safety training and safety education and try to keep that in your budget. That's what those of us that participate in safety organizations, that's what we're worried about. We want to make sure that safety doesn't suffer just because our budgets have suffered so bad.
So what are those, I guess, more specific budget lines that you want to stress should be very much protective? Is it the memberships in these associations, or is it more down at the location, facility level? What should people make sure that aren't being cut out?
So one example would be when you look at incidents and you look at things that happen over time and the things that usually happen, it's either an operations thing went wrong or something in maintenance went wrong. And so whatever your organization does for operational training and for maintenance safety training. So whether you typically go to AIMS or NAARSO and in prior years, you're thinking to yourself, oh, that was really expensive because I had to get an airplane, I had to get a hotel, I had to send my people away for a week. Well, guess what? Thanks to COVID, it's all gone virtual. IAPA conference went virtual. So a lot of this safety training is now gone virtual. So you can still get the training done at a much lesser cost. But those would be the 2 areas, and that's my personal opinion, is looking at in the operations area or in the maintenance area, safety training in those 2 areas.
Yeah, and I think all these conferences going virtual, I mean, in theory, should really expand the audience, of people that can participate, right? So now all that money you're saving on hotels and flights and rental cars and meals and all that kind of stuff, maybe you could send more people to that conference virtually than you would have in the past. So I just think it, as much as I love in-person, events, and I can't wait till we can meet again in person. I do think that's one of the benefits or the unintended consequences of being able to meet virtually.
I totally agree. Yeah, we got to always look for the positive things, right?
Yeah.
That's the positive thing COVID has brought us, is it's really launched us into this virtual world. And I sit on the board of AIMS, and we're spending a lot of time right now thinking about what technology are we going to use? How do we still bring that interpersonal sitting and chatting and talking, like, the three of us today on this screen? How do we create those small group conversations and still get those best practice safety idea sharing in a virtual environment while still getting the training done? And so I know AIMS is putting a lot of effort into that. IAP has done that. NAARSO has done that. And so maybe the way you've done safety training in the past, also look at maybe a different way to do it. If you're going through your budget line items and you're like, oh man, that was a really fat budget line item. Well, there might be different ways to do it today, that you can do it virtually, maybe even send more people and still spend less money.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious, kind of going back to the volunteering and the contributing side of things. We definitely understand the importance of volunteering or contributing, even if it's a little bit. I guess maybe to get a little bit more specific, what are some of the qualifications needed in order to be someone who can raise their hand and contribute, and what types of contributions might people not know that they are able to offer?
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah, let me think about that for a second. So in ASTM, one of the things we desperately need is that, and I keep going back to diversity of thought. When we create standards, sometimes those standards end up getting used by someone that's maybe a brand new facility, never worked in the industry before, doesn't know anything about the industry, and they've got to be able to pick up this document from day one, understand it, and be able to read it. Now, if that document was written by someone who's worked in the industry for 20 years, that document might be written in a way that that person can understand, but not in a way that someone new to the industry can understand. So one of the areas, and we've actually really grown our college student participation in ASTM, and what they bring is, if you're an inquisitive person that likes to solve problems, that's your minimum requirement. Because when they sit in the room and they're hearing that language for the first time, if they have a little bit of a technical background, maybe they worked in a park as an ops person for a summer, they have just a little experience, maybe they're just a theme park fanatic and they've been to all kinds of theme parks around the world, but they have a little bit of background in the industry, and then they hear that paragraph and they're like, wait, what? What did you mean by that? That is so valuable in ASTM. So the qualifications for participating in ASTM would be just volunteering your time. The membership fee is very low. I think it's like $70 or $75 right now to become a member, and you get all the standards. Our next meeting in February is going to be virtual as well. We're not going to be meeting in person. So just dedicating your time to show up, to listen, and then when you hear something that doesn't make sense to you, asking an educated question. That's all that it takes for ASTM. Now, I'll give you the example in AIMS and NAARSO. It's a volunteer event, and we teach 200-300 classes, so we need instructors for all those classes. We need volunteers to help call up those instructors, to schedule the instructors, to review the material, to help the day of, to coordinate, to be room monitors. Don't need a lot of background for that. Just a couple hours in your schedule and the willingness to want to help. And what's great about that is you'll just meet wonderful people, because you'll be given a list of people to call. Hey, go call these people and check with them on their session and see if they need any help recording their video, and help them review their material, or maybe they need help practicing. And we have an education committee, both organizations, AIMS and NAARSO, they have an education committee where you volunteer on that committee, and then you just help coordinate the classes. So you could be someone who's brand new to the industry, or you could be someone that's 20 years in the industry and has a bunch of connections and contacts, and maybe even your own list of, well, I want to make sure this is on the schedule and make sure you do a class in this and go call this guy because he'll do a really good job at it. We need all kinds of people. That's a great question. Yeah, because sometimes people are scared to volunteer. They think, oh, I don't have anything to offer.
Yeah.
Honestly, your time and your enthusiasm. That's all we need.
No, I appreciate that because, throughout this conversation, you've sold me in on the idea of volunteering. And then I think, well, I focus on guest experience. I focus on, guest service and guest feedback. Maybe it's too disconnected from everything kind of into the nitty gritty of, everything safety. And I'm sure there's many other people listening who might be, saying something similar of, I'd love to be able to volunteer, but I don't qualify. And I think that you've definitely debunked that myth.
Yeah.
There of potentially not qualifying to volunteer, because there's always something, even if it's the administrative and coordinative positions. So thank you for that. As we start to wind this down here, one of the last notes that I want to make sure we cover is you've mentioned of how the industry is constantly finding ways to improve safety and security, but that ride systems are the safest today that they have ever been. And the plan is in 20 years from now that we can say the same thing. Ride systems today are the safest they've ever been. So can you give maybe a little context kind of to that saying, or just this mindset of this continual improvement of the standard?
Okay. And I'll answer that from a technology perspective, because that's what I do for a living. And I got some good examples. So if you bought a car 10 years ago, 15 years ago, we all know that we need to check the air pressure in the tires. But how many times before you got in your car and drove it, did you actually walk around the car, inspect all 4 tires, get an air pressure gauge, walk up to the tire and check the air pressure? I know I didn't. How many flat tires did I get? Great, because I didn't check. But my car nowadays, I can be sitting at the dash, and just the other day, my car like blinked and told me, hey, your air pressure just went down 1 PSI in your front tire. You might want to check it. So just like the technology in our cars have gotten smarter, the technology in our phones, I mean, we used to have to carry a calculator, a phone, a camera, a calendar book, and like now it's all in our phone. The technology for our attractions has changed the same way. And then the way that safety is done has also changed. So I know when I was growing up as a kid, my dad taught me how to drive. He said if I got on an icy road or I was hydroplaning, that, pump the brakes real carefully. So we knew how to do anti-lock brakes manually, but now it's kind of built in the car. So when I look at control systems technology for attractions, that same kind of concept has happened. We're still doing safety the same way, but technology is helping us do it faster and easier. So I always knew how to anti-lock brake, pump my brakes, but now I don't have to do that because the car does it for me. So when a design engineer sits down and wants to program a new PLC, that's the controllers that are used on attractions, they used to have to write a lot of code and do a lot of the engineering themselves. Well, now it's like Lego blocks. They just pull out this piece and pull out this piece and pull out this piece and put it together. But what that results in is you have to keep up with the technology. And you can't just learn it on the job. I teach a lot of safety technology classes, and what I tell my engineers, I'm like, look, the days of not reading the manual are over. You've got to read the manual. The technology has so many features and so many options to use, but you also have to make sure you put it together correctly and that you use it correctly. And the same thing goes for like security screening technology when you're first coming into a park, or new lighting technology or new camera technology. Technology has changed way faster than our brains can even imagine. And so we have to slow down for a moment. We have to take the time to educate ourselves, and we have to read the manuals and work with the manufacturers that make this technology. That's what they're there for, is to help educate you on how to use the technology and ensure that you're using it in the best, most efficient, safest way. And so I'd say the call to action on that one would be is if it's been a while since you've sat down and maybe done a little research on new technology used in your role, and I would say it's in every role, right, Josh? I mean, you probably have new software programs you're using and artificial intelligence and new ways of doing reporting, and it's no more, you know, handwritten Excel spreadsheets. It's changed in every job. And meeting people that have your same kind of job and just asking questions and getting to know and attending conferences and listening to podcasts like this, you got to keep up with it.
Yeah, that's a great bit of advice, and always looking for different ways that you can make your job, no matter what it is. If you're working in an office, how can you make your job safer? One sort of follow up to that, if I could connect the dots, Josh and I both come from the operator world, right? We were the ride operators that you're talking about, that you're building your systems for. And I was relating a story to Josh just before this, that when I first started, this was 30 years ago, everything was completely manual. So I'm running a ride and I'm adjusting the air pressure on the brakes and popping the brakes and things like that. Now, if that ride were run with an automated system, absolutely it's going to be safer. There's no doubt about it. But then my question is, where does the employee come in that design process? And we may not have time to go into that whole process, but thinking about the end user and what their role is and how they fit in, I'm just curious a little, if you could just expand on that just a little bit.
So it should come up during that risk assessment process. So if I'm creating a system that's automatic and has automatic built-in safety features, then how am I making that intuitive for the operator that's controlling the ride? And then part of the design process is, so when you're doing safety, there's always a 3-step process. You identify the hazard, and after you identify the hazard, you ask yourself 3 questions. Is there any way that I can just get rid of this hazard so that it's just not there? A lot of our attractions, we can't do that. So you go to question 2. How do I mitigate it against it? How do I make the hazard a little bit less? So in your example where you were controlling the air brakes, well, one of the hazards is that you would not give the right air pressure to the air brake, and maybe the brake wouldn't engage when it needs to engage, okay? Mm-hmm. So how do you reduce that hazard? Well, now we're gonna make it automatic. But then when I make it automatic, then the third question you ask yourself is, what do I need to do to inform the people that interact with this piece of equipment how it operates? Because they're gonna have to do 3 things with it. They're gonna have to train people how to use it, they're gonna have to operate it, and they have to maintain it. And so writing really good manuals, that's another thing I like to joke with engineers about. I know you love to come in and draw pretty drawings and write up code, but guess what? You gotta use your words, and you have to write manuals too. And you have to write really good manuals. But to write those manuals, you have to think about the person who's using that equipment. And this is also where human factors comes in. Dr. Catherine Woodcock talks about this a lot. It's not just the human factors of the guest, but it's also the human factors of the operator. Did you logically put the e-stop button where it's visibly easy for the person to see? And does every control panel in your park have the e-stop in the same place? Because that's like muscle memory, right? Most people are right-handed. So do you put the e-stop button in the middle, or do you put it more to the right? So thinking about that comes into the design process, which should be happening during that risk assessment meeting. Because how the person interacts with the equipment, that's a hazard. And so you have to think about ways to make it easier for the person to do that. One big conversation that's come up is, we used to have displays. When we moved from everything being manual buttons to displays, the first version of displays were black and white. The technology in the late 90s, it was all black and white. Then color came in, and everybody got super excited and was like, oh, I'm gonna make these beautiful color panels with all these bright flashy lights. Well, we ended up getting information overload. And there's some interesting research that was actually done by the Navy, the United States Navy, that they realized they made their ship consoles way too complicated. And so they actually went back and kind of dumbed them down. They ripped out all these beautiful new electronics they put in, and they came back in and found that right marriage of how much is technology, but how much still needs to be human interaction and human touch, and not color overload and not information overload. So that's part of user design interface and should be part of everyone's design process.
That's so interesting. And it
Yeah.
even makes me think, I've operated rides that, may have been the same manufacturer and, built within a few years from each other. But the one that was built 3 years later had just, a system that was similar to the other, but it was just slightly more intuitive. And I remember thinking, wow, I really like operating this ride actually a lot more than the other ride, even though it's all very similar. And then a few years after that, Matt, you came in and visited me at the park I was running. And I was like, Matt, I've got this 1964 Tilt-A-Whirl right here. Check this out. And I'm like moving the lever back and forth and just thinking how different it was. That complexity component is really interesting too, of maybe an improvement that seems like it's more intuitive, whereas inadvertently maybe making something more complicated. And I imagine there's a feedback loop kind of, going back to make sure that the operators are getting the best use out of the systems that they're being provided with and expected to be very proficient on very quickly. So Linda, this was an incredibly interesting conversation. I feel like we could keep going and probably nerd out in a lot of different directions here. But in the meantime, Linda, if people want to get a hold of you directly, where would you send them?
Oh, please. Yeah. Reach out to me on LinkedIn if you have any questions. So Linda A. Freeman. You can search for Linda Freeman, Rockwell Automation. I should pop up. If you have any questions about any of the organizations I've talked about today, or volunteering, or you would like to volunteer, or you'd like to learn more about safety or get more involved in the area of safety, yeah, please reach out. I can help connect you with folks that would love your enthusiasm and your time.
Great. Excellent. Well, Linda, thank you so much for your time today. We really appreciate having the opportunity to get to chat with you. And to everyone out there watching or listening, just remember, we are all Attraction Pros.
Thanks for listening to the Attraction Pros podcast.
Make sure to subscribe so you can tune in when new episodes release. And even better, please leave us a review on iTunes.
For more information, visit AttractionPros.com.